Okay, great. Welcome everyone. Very nice to see so many of you. Maybe very brief introduction to this meetup. So this is the first event in hopefully a series about using knowledge graphs in cultural heritage, where we like to discuss various topics that come up when doing this. And in this first event, we kicked that off by looking at what we have and are still doing in Netwerk Oorlogsbronnen. So for the English speakers, probably most of you already have heard of Oorlogsbronnen. If you have not, that literally translates to war sources. I will not use that name anymore. I will keep saying Oorlogsbronnen. Sometimes I will use the acronym for Netwerk Oorlogsbronnen, which is NOB, which NOB in English, but I will say it in Dutch. So you know what I'm talking about. I am Michiel Hildebrand from Spinque. And what I want to do today with you is describe and illustrate how Oorlogsbronnen has moved from a collection portal to a platform where they can tell stories. And in this process, there is an essential role for the entities in this domain. So the persons, the places, the events, and how we organize them in a knowledge graph to allow these stories to be told. But let's start with the beginning then. So for Oorlogsbronnen, the beginning could be, at least in terms of the software, could be marked as Oorlogsbronnen 1.0. This is before Spinque joined. And as you see here, this is the prototypical collection portal. So you see the result of a search engine where you see different sources, right? So what they have done, if they have harvested from different organizations, their collection data, with the metadata, put that all into a search engine, an interface on top of it, and you can search through those collections, right? And you see here some results, and typically here also the facets on the left side. Well, you know all these type of things. So if you look at this a little bit more schematically, then what we see happening here is that we have, of course, various collection objects. Here, three examples, three types actually: a photo, a video, and an archive. There are various other types, but just three chosen here, all about the Dam incident that happened on the 7th of May, 1945 in Amsterdam. Of course, these things are described with metadata. Here, which is very sparse, you just see one thing. It could be a title, it could be subject, it doesn't really matter here. The point is, right, that here they are strings now. And what we all know nowadays, and what we all try to do, is to go from those strings to things, right? So instead of having strings there, we want to know, okay, there is this concept, the Dam incident, and all those three things are actually related to the same concept. And then this concept could be described, right? In this case, in Oorlogsbronnen, this is also done in the World War II thesaurus, the WWII thesaurus, and that could provide information like alternative labels. Now, that could be very nice because you can use this type of information in search, right? So you can use alternative labels, maybe even in different languages. But my point here is actually not so much that. Because all these things, what they always start from is that the collection objects are the foreground. That is what we are interested in. And we have now better integrated the metadata, but this metadata, the role remains the background, right? So it purposes those collection objects. Now, for those a bit more interested in technology aspects, right, you can typically capture this type of thing in SCOS as a concept. We'll come back to that later. But the more we start linking, the more we start to attach to it, the picture is slightly changing, right? Because we have articles about it. We have maybe people that were actually victims there. And we might know that this is not just a concept, but this is actually an event that happened to take place on the 7th of May, 1945 at the Dam Square in Amsterdam, right? So we are transitioning from this sort of concept in our SCOS world to an event much richer with various types of relationships in a knowledge graph. And from this picture, it becomes, of course, immediately clear that there is a different way of looking at things now. We can consider those entities foreground instead of background. And that is actually the whole story that I want to tell here. And of course, now I'll illustrate how we then do that in Oorlogsbronnen. But this point here, that is the message of my story for today, putting those entities in the foreground. This was our first attempt in doing that. My apologies that I don't have the example of the Dam incident here. We didn't have that anymore because this is an older version of the Oorlogsbronnen interface. But I guess you can translate this, right? So here you have search for something and we found an entity, in this case, the Atlantic Wall. And on the right side, just like you are accustomed to on your Google search result page, you see a so-called knowledge panel where we present information about this entity. Now, this is all nice, but it turned out it didn't really work so well for Oorlogsbronnen as it does for Google. And probably the reason is for Google, it is used, or Google uses it to bring their users very quickly to facts. And that was not really necessary here, or it's not really the use case in Oorlogsbronnen. So it turns out that there is actually a lot more that Oorlogsbronnen wants to tell about their persons, events, and locations. And you see that here. So in the current version, what we do now is when you search, all kinds of entities are actually search results as well. And you can click on them. And then you land on a page for that entity. And now on this entity, we can tell a story, or we can tell stories about it, right? So we saw the events, we saw photos. Here are those people, that most of them were victims there at the Dam incident. A video, a person mentioning or talking about it, other sources, the locations, etc. Right? So there now is a place where we can actually put this event in the foreground. And what is interesting about this is that Oorlogsbronnen, that before was this collection portal that was only referring to the sources of their partners, right? Providing those collection objects. They have now become an authority, not on the collection objects, that is still the owners, but sort of the things that are in between it, the entities, in this case, the Dam incident. And what you see as a consequence also is that when you now Google for this on Google, we search for it on Google, then it actually pops out quite high in the ranking. It's not the same for all search queries, but for this particular example, it actually is second after Wikipedia. So that is an entity in the foreground. Now, you might think that is very nice, Michiel, but you are talking about a story and you just showed me a page with an entity showing various things about it, but is that really a story? Well, I would kind of agree with that argument that maybe not yet. And I think we can do much better there. And I think part of it that we're not doing it so well there yet is because we don't really understand all the events yet and how they are related to each other. But we'll come back to that later. And the whole point, of course, is that we can improve on that. And in other areas, I think we'll already be doing a better job there. So let's switch to persons. Actually, it's a very similar story because what happens is there is all kinds of databases, collections coming from institutions that have, well, in this case, we call them records with metadata, typically strings, about the person. And of course, we want to do exactly the same thing here. We want to make things out of those, right? And here, now, yeah, I guess you can guess it. What do we want to say? Yeah, this is not three different persons, but this is actually the same person, right? So that was the first question when Network Oorlogsbronnen came to us, when they want to start working with persons. Can you do this? Can you find out what is the same person in all this information? And we can do that by linking these persons together based on various criteria, right? So we get one person mentioned in different records here. And of course, you see it already a bit portrayed, is that now we can put this person in the foreground. But when we were doing this, we actually noticed something that I found much more interesting. And that is that in these records, there is more information. It's not just a person mentioned. There is a lot of other information, sometimes explicit and sometimes implicit. And that you see here. So for those of you who know the Oorlogsbronnen Stichting, it's probably clear that they say something about the birth and the death of a person. But Kamp Vught, the card of Kamp Vught, if you look at it, of course, it says something about that person being imprisoned. But the funny thing is, it's not really mentioned explicitly there, right? But you can derive it because it is a card from Vught. And the same holds for Amersfoort. But this also contains information about transports from Amersfoort or to Amersfoort. So what we started doing is trying to capture all these events from those different records and make them explicit. Sometimes that was straightforward from the information that was there, and sometimes it had to be more derived and put in there. And what you see now here is that what we have in the foreground is not just a integrated person, but is the events of that person, the events in the life of that person. And now we can start telling stories with these events. And how that's currently done on the website, here's an example where we see those events and they're illustrated with sources. And in fact, in this version, they're also contextualized. So we can say this person is born somewhere. So this, when the war started, he was there. This is what it meant for him because he was in the resistance, or maybe this person was Jewish. So there is different context that we can start presenting around it. Now, how exactly this is done is not my task to illustrate further, and that will come later in the other talks. My point here is we transition from those records in the foreground to the entities in the foreground. And in this case, those records also supporting that and providing evidence and background and illustration. So that is one way of looking at this. But of course, we're now creating a whole graph with all kinds of entities related in various ways. So we can start picking angles and perspectives, how we want to look at things. So instead of looking at the person, we can start looking at a place and actually use the persons from this place to tell a different story. So here you see Rotterdam and Amsterdam next to each other. And you see statistics about the victims from people coming from those places, right? The types of people. And very interesting here on the left side, you see, of course, a peak in the beginning of 1940, where was the bombing of Rotterdam, where a lot of people died. And in Amsterdam, this peak is not there because it was not bombed, right? So now we can start to tell sort of a data story by the victims of a place. Another way of looking at places you see here in Limburg. So here we're not looking at the people, but here we're looking at events in Limburg. Right? So Limburg was liberated already starting in September 44. But it took a while to liberate, of course, the whole of Netherlands, but the whole of Limburg. So here we see those events animated, popping up whenever this happened. Right? So here Limburg is in the foreground, and those events that happened help us to tell the story. And you can find two other examples of stories in Limburg. So basically, that is what I tried to explain to you, that what we're doing is we are putting those entities in the foreground, providing us a world where we can make all kinds of perspectives and angles and tell stories about what happened in World War II using those entities. So I hope this gives you a bit of a picture what we're doing with Oorlogsbronnen. I hope that it also resonates, particularly with those that are working at cultural heritage institutions. So for you, I have wrote down some questions that you can take home, think about it. So in terms of those collections, right? What are the sources that I have? Which objects, what type of objects do I have? And of course, these are your sort of collection objects, but it goes further, right? It's also your literature, it's your research, maybe other stuff that you have. And of course, there is information outside that might also be relevant. And once you have that, that sort of creates your scope, your domain. Now, on top of that, you can start thinking of then what are those entities that exist there? And about which of those entities do I actually want to be an authority? About which of these entities or types of entities do I want to tell the story? And if you know that, then of course you can start thinking about how do I then want to tell my story? And which sources and other entities are relevant for this story and can I use for that purpose? Okay, good luck with that. And if you have some questions now, I think you can raise your hand and we can come to that now before we can continue with the other speakers.
Yeah, thanks, Michiel. In the chat, I don't see any questions. I don't know if there are questions right now, maybe one or two. I see one now from Andre. He asks, do you work only with named entities?
So the things that I mentioned here, right? Persons, events, locations, those are named entities. Of course, there are also still the typical concept type of things that you see in the thesaurus. Those are also there, like a particular type of bunker or airplane or something. So those are also there. And there are also events of, so the events of the people are typically not named, right? So the specific imprisonment of that person is not per se a named entity, right? It's a very specific event for that person, which could have been related to a named entity, namely a transport or a bombing or a razzia, right? So there are relations between then those named entities and those personal entities.
All right. Thanks, Michiel. I think it's a good idea to take the questions after the meetings and or after the presentations. So we try to stick a bit to the flow of presentations. So thanks, Michiel.
Yeah, you're welcome. I see two questions about entities. I think that will also be how to link entities. I think part of that will be covered also in the talk from Lizzie, and otherwise join me afterwards in the breakout room.
Yeah, thanks. All right.